In episode 1, we laid out the evidence. A man was executed. His tomb was found empty. His followers, his persecutor, and his skeptical brother all claimed to see him alive. The proclamation began within years, not centuries, of the events. Those are the facts. Now, what explains them? For 2,000 years, scholars have proposed alternatives to the resurrection. Not amateurs, serious historians, psychologists, and medical experts. Each theory attempts to explain the same stubborn data without invoking the supernatural. This is not a sermon, it's an investigation, and every suspect gets a fair hearing. Think of this like a detective's lineup. We have 7 suspects, 7 theories that have been proposed to explain the facts we established in episode 1. We're going to examine each one, present it at its strongest, and then test it against the evidence. Some of these theories were serious contenders, some were abandoned centuries ago, and some are still debated today. But every one of them has to answer the same question: can it explain all the facts? Not some of them, all of them. The empty tomb, the appearances, the conversions of Paul and James, the early creed, the transformation of the disciples. A theory that explains one fact but not the others is incomplete, and an incomplete theory is not a solution. Suspect 1, the Swoon Theory, the idea that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. He fainted, was mistaken for dead, revived in the cool air of the tomb, and appeared to his disciples. It sounds plausible for about 30 seconds. Then you look at the medical evidence. In 1986, the Journal of the American Medical Association published a detailed analysis of crucifixion by a team from the Mayo Clinic. Their conclusion: death resulted from hypovolemic shock and exhaustion asphyxia. The scourging alone caused deep lacerations and massive blood loss. The nail wounds, the hours of suffocation, and then the spear thrust between the ribs, which, according to the JAMA study, likely perforated the right lung, the pericardium, and the heart. Their verdict: Jesus was dead when taken down from the cross. But here's what's remarkable. The Swoon Theory wasn't killed by a Christian. It was killed by a skeptic. In 1835, the German theologian David Friedrich Strauss, who himself rejected the resurrection, demolished the theory with a single argument. A man who had crawled half-dead out of a tomb, bleeding, broken, in need of a physician, could never have convinced his disciples that he was the risen Lord of life. Such a figure would have inspired pity, not worship. Strauss's critique was so devastating that no serious scholar has defended the Swoon Theory since. Suspect 2, the Stolen Body Theory. This one is ancient. It's recorded in Matthew's Gospel as the counterclaim circulated by the Jewish authorities. The disciples stole the body and faked the resurrection. Notice something interesting about this accusation. The authorities are conceding that the tomb was empty. They're not denying it. They're trying to explain it. That's enemy attestation. But the theory collapses under its own weight. Stealing a body doesn't produce encounters with a living person. It doesn't explain the appearances to Peter, to the 12, to the 500, to Paul, to James. And it doesn't explain why the disciples would then spend the rest of their lives being beaten, imprisoned, and executed for a claim they knew was a lie. People die for beliefs they hold to be true. They don't die for hoaxes they invented. Suspect 3, the Wrong Tomb Theory. Proposed in 1907 by the Harvard scholar Kersop Lake, the idea: the women went to the wrong tomb on Easter morning. They found it empty, panicked, and the misunderstanding snowballed into a resurrection claim. The problems are obvious. Joseph of Arimathea knew where the tomb was, he owned it. The Jewish authorities could have produced the body from the correct tomb and ended the movement overnight. And most critically, the wrong tomb doesn't explain the appearances. Even if the women made a mistake, why did Peter, Paul, James, and 500 others claim to see Jesus alive? Lake himself acknowledged the theory's limitations. Almost no scholar has defended it since. Suspect 4, the Twin or Impostor Theory. Someone who looked like Jesus appeared to the disciples after the crucifixion. This theory has never been taken seriously in academic scholarship. It doesn't explain the empty tomb, the real body would still be there. It doesn't explain the intimate knowledge the risen figure displayed. And it doesn't explain Paul's conversion. Paul had never met Jesus before his Damascus Road experience. There's no one to impersonate. We can set this one aside. Suspect 5, the Hallucination Hypothesis. This is the strongest naturalistic theory, and it deserves serious examination. The leading proponent is Gerd Ludemann, an atheist New Testament professor at the University of Göttingen. Ludemann's argument goes like this. Peter, overwhelmed by guilt over denying Jesus, experienced a grief-induced hallucination. He saw Jesus alive. This vision then triggered a chain reaction among the other disciples, a kind of psychological contagion. Paul's Damascus Road experience was a different phenomenon, a Christ complex born of his inner conflict with Judaism. It's a sophisticated theory, and Ludemann is a serious scholar. He accepts that the disciples genuinely had experiences. He calls it historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. He just interprets those experiences as hallucinations, not encounters with a physical person. So what's the problem? Several. First, hallucinations are individual experiences, they are not shared. The clinical literature is clear on this. Hallucinations occur inside one person's brain, they are not transmitted to groups. But the resurrection appearances include groups. The 12, the 500, these are not individual grief visions. Second, the psychological profile doesn't fit. Grief hallucinations require grief. Peter was grieving, that works. But Paul wasn't grieving. Paul was hostile. He was actively persecuting Christians. And James wasn't grieving either. He was a skeptic who thought his brother was out of his mind. Grief hallucinations don't happen to people who aren't grieving. Third, and this is the deepest problem, grief hallucinations don't produce claims of bodily resurrection. The clinical literature on bereavement visions shows that 30 to 60% of bereaved spouses report some sensory experience of the deceased. But these experiences are brief, private, and comforting. They don't lead people to proclaim that the dead person has been physically raised and is now Lord of the universe. The content of the disciples' claims goes far beyond anything in the clinical literature on grief hallucinations. Suspect 6. The legend theory. The idea that the resurrection stories grew over time, that what started as a vague spiritual experience was gradually embellished into a physical resurrection through decades of oral tradition. This was the dominant view in German scholarship for much of the 20th century, championed by Rudolf Bultmann. And there's a grain of truth in it. The Gospel accounts do become more detailed over time. Mark's account is sparse. Luke adds a scene where Jesus eats fish. John adds Thomas touching the wounds. But the legend theory has a fatal problem, the timeline. The creed in 1 Corinthians 15, the one Paul says he received from others, dates to within 1 to 5 years of the crucifixion. That's not a scholarly estimate from Christian apologists. That's the consensus of critical scholars, including atheists. Gerd Ludemann dates it to within 2 to 3 years. James Dunn says it was formulated within months. To put that in perspective, the earliest biographies of Alexander the Great were written over 300 years after his death. The earliest testimony to the resurrection, less than 5 years. Legends don't develop that fast, not when the eyewitnesses are still alive, not when the creed names specific people and says most of them can still be checked. The legend theory requires a timeline that the evidence doesn't support. Suspect 7. Cognitive dissonance. In 1956, the psychologist Leon Festinger studied a UFO cult whose predicted apocalypse failed to materialize. Instead of abandoning their beliefs, some members doubled down and began proselytizing. The theory has been applied to the disciples. Their messianic expectations were shattered by the crucifixion, and they resolved the psychological tension by inventing the resurrection. It's a clever theory, but it has a fundamental problem. Cognitive dissonance produces rationalization within existing categories. The cult members didn't invent a new religion. They reinterpreted their existing beliefs, but the disciples did something that has no parallel in Jewish history. They proclaimed that a single individual had been bodily raised from the dead before the general resurrection at the end of time. That concept didn't exist in Jewish theology. There was no category for it. Cognitive dissonance explains why people reinterpret failed prophecies. It doesn't explain why people invent entirely new theological concepts that have no precedent in their tradition. And there's another problem. Recent archival research has challenged Festinger's original study. The UFO cult leader actually recanted. The group dissolved. The foundational case study for belief intensification after disconfirmation may itself be flawed. So where does that leave us? Let's be honest about the scorecard. The The Swoon Theory was demolished in 1835 by a skeptic. The stolen body theory doesn't explain the appearances or the conversions. The wrong tomb theory doesn't explain the appearances. The twin theory was never serious. The hallucination hypothesis, the strongest contender, can't account for group experiences, hostile witnesses, or the specific content of the claims. The legend theory is destroyed by the early dating of the creed. And cognitive dissonance can't explain the creation of an entirely new theological category. Now some scholars try to combine theories. Maybe the women went to the wrong tomb and then Peter had a grief hallucination, and then the story grew into a legend over time. It's a reasonable instinct if no single theory works, maybe a combination does. But combination theories have their own problem. Each component still has to survive scrutiny. The wrong tomb still doesn't explain the appearances. The hallucination still doesn't account for Paul and James. And the legend timeline is still too short. Stacking weak explanations doesn't produce a strong one, it produces a more complicated weak one. The Princeton scholar Dale Allison, who has spent decades studying this question and who takes the naturalistic explanations more seriously than almost anyone, puts it with painful honesty. He accepts the empty tomb as probable. He takes the appearance traditions seriously. But he admits that historical method alone cannot tell us whether what happened was a miracle or something else entirely. His conclusion, the purely historical evidence is not so good as to make disbelief unreasonable, and it is not so bad as to make faith untenable. That's not evasion. That's intellectual honesty from a man who has looked at the evidence longer and harder than most. So does this prove the resurrection happened? No. It proves that every naturalistic theory proposed so far has significant problems. That's not the same thing. The resurrection hypothesis has its own challenge. It requires accepting the possibility of the supernatural, which many scholars exclude on principle. And that's a legitimate methodological choice. You can look at the same evidence and reach different conclusions depending on what you consider possible. But here's what's remarkable. The Jewish scholar Jezza Vermes, who had no theological stake in the outcome, examined all the evidence and all the theories. His conclusion, when every argument has been considered and weighed, the only conclusion acceptable to the historian must be that the opinions of the orthodox, the liberal and the ultra-liberal alike are inadequate to account for the evidence. That's not a Christian speaking. That's an Oxford historian saying, none of the explanations work, not the traditional ones. Not the skeptical ones, not the liberal ones, none of them. This is where the investigation stands. The facts from episode 1 remain stubborn, the alternative theories from this episode remain inadequate, and the question remains genuinely open. But there's one more line of evidence we haven't examined. What did the people who had every reason to deny the resurrection actually say about it? What did Rome say? What did the rabbis say? What did the enemies of Christianity, the people with the most to lose, record about these events? That's episode 3. 7 theories, 2,000 years of scrutiny, and not one of them fully explains the data. The Swoon Theory died in 1835, the legend theory died with the dating of the creed, the hallucination hypothesis remains, but it can't account for the full pattern of evidence. The puzzle is still open, and the investigation continues.